and welcome to the program. I'm Melissa Walker in Lagos. We begin with the group of 7 G7 leaders who held their first plenary session today in the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The 3-day gathering ending on Sunday is expected to see leaders debate strategy on the more than year-long conflict in Ukraine and other global issues. Earlier today, the leaders visited the Peace Memorial in the city leveled by an atomic bomb in World War II. Meanwhile, an official familiar with the G7 planning says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will travel in person to Japan for the summit. The G7 comprises Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United States. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will be in that meeting, as we mentioned. The war in Ukraine is top on the agenda for the 3-day summit, where leaders are expected to make a strong statement of unity in support of Ukraine, as well as unveil new measures to choke off Russia's ability to fund and supply its war. Zelensky's expected visit will be his first to Asia since Moscow launched the full-scale assault and comes as Kyiv continues to look to its Western partners for military backing ahead of a highly anticipated counter-offensive. The Ukrainian president is expected to travel to Asia. His visit follows a 4-country European tour where he is welcoming additional pledges of military support for Kyiv's defense. Charles Michel said that it was in the European Union's interest to maintain a stable and constructive cooperation with China, speaking on the sidelines of the Group of 7 Leaders Summit in Japan's Hiroshima city. Mr. Michel added that the EU would call on China to step up pressure on Russia to stop its military aggression in Ukraine.
We are now focused on shutting the door on loopholes and continuing to cut Russia off from critical supplies. We will restrict trade in Russian diamonds. Russian diamonds are not forever. And we will lay out openly and frankly why these sanctions are necessary and justified. And constructive relation with China is in our mutual interest. The EU is firm on our values. We will keep voicing our concerns on human rights, whether it is in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, or in Tibet. We also need to engage together with China on global challenges, climate change, conservation of natural resources, biodiversity, debt sustainability. Given its role in the international community and the size of its economy, China has a special responsibility in the world. It has to play by international rules, and we call on China to press Russia to stop its military aggression. There are ties between Russia and Iran. It's not a secret for all of us, but we intend to maximize our diplomatic efforts and to use the different leverage we have in order to convince Iran not to take wrong decisions with regard with this possible support for Russia.
Well, French President Emmanuel Macron and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held a meeting on the sidelines of the Group of 7 summit in Japan. The two thanked each other for their countries' cooperation bilaterally and on the world stage. Mr. Macron said they both talked about climate challenges and the question of artificial intelligence.
Merci beaucoup, cher Justin, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Je partage ce qui vient d'être dit. Je pense que nos présidents du G7...
Leaders of the Group of 7 countries, they've agreed to impose further sanctions on Russia and have reaffirmed their commitment to stand against Moscow's illegal, unjustifiable and unprovoked war in Ukraine. Britain has unveiled new sanctions against Russia, targeting imports of diamonds, minerals and advanced military technology in a bid to choke Moscow's ability to fight the war in Ukraine. The further sanctions and measures are intended to increase the cost to Russia and those who are supporting its war effort and build on efforts to ensure that Russia is no longer able to weaponize the availability of energy. The G7 demands that Russia immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw its troops and military equipment from the entire internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. They also agreed to new sanctions to starve Russia of G7 technology, industrial equipment and services that support its war machine. In the meantime, a group of Japanese activists took to the streets in the western Japanese city of Hiroshima to protest against the G7 leaders' summit and nuclear war. Flagged by police, some in riot gear, the protesters marched through a main street in the central city, not far from the Peace Memorial Park, where several G7 summit events were also being held. The protesters said their ire was sparked by a meeting of leaders of several nuclear-armed powers, including the U.S., in a city that was devastated by the world's first atomic bomb in 1945. The demonstrators also accused some G7 countries of stoking regional tension with Japan's neighbor, China. Away from the summit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky landed in Jeddah to attend an Arab League summit where Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, heavily backed by Russia in his country's civil war, was also present. Addressing the summit, Mr. Zelensky said he hoped that the participants were attending for the sake of peace and justice. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman mediated in the Russia-Ukraine conflict last year, where he secured the release of 10 foreigners captured by Russia in Ukraine. The move was apparently made possible by his close ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Gulf states have tried to remain neutral in the Ukraine conflict, despite Western pressure on Gulf oil producers to help isolate Russia, a fellow OPEC+ member.
At first, I express my gratitude for the warm hospitality to His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to the entire people of Saudi Arabia and the city of Jeddah, which is hosting this meeting. I hope that most of us are here for the sake of peace and justice. Dear participants of the summit, today is the 450th day of the full-scale war waged against us by Russian invaders.
Well, staying with the Ukrainian president, he has set up an advisory council to restore Ukrainian rule over Russia-annexed Crimea, saying the work to liberate the peninsula was ongoing amid expectation of Kyiv's counteroffensive. Mr. Zelensky said that more and more countries realized that it was impossible to restore justice without returning Crimea seized and annexed by Russia in 2014. Russia shows no sign of abandoning Crimea, home to its Black Sea Fleet, and has used the peninsula as a platform to launch missile strikes on Ukrainian targets. Mr. Zelensky and other officials held a minute of silence to remember victims of the 1944 deportation of some 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Siberia and Central Asia under the orders of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. However, Moscow has denied accusations of human rights abuses in Crimea and says a referendum held after Russian forces seized the peninsula 9 years ago showed Crimeans genuinely want to be part of Russia. And Colonel General Oleksandr Syrsky, commander of Ukrainian ground forces, released a video to show Ukrainian forces attacking and destroying Russian units near Bakhmut. Now, a caption to the video posted in Telegram messaging app said it shows activities by the 225th Kharkiv Battalion in Bakhmut area. Ukraine's military said it had made new territorial gains in heavy fighting around the eastern city of Bakhmut, despite being outgunned and outnumbered by Russian forces. In the past week, Kyiv has said it has stepped up pressure on Moscow's troops to the north and south of Bakhmut. Ukrainian officials have signaled that the advances around Bakhmut are not part of a broader counteroffensive planned by Kyiv to push back the Russian forces. We're back to talking about the G7 meeting, where members of the meeting plan to discuss the provision of fighter jets for Ukraine during the summit. Defense Minister Arild Gram says Norway donating F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine is not on the agenda at the moment. Ukrainian president says he was making progress in persuading the West to supply Ukraine with fighter jets. That's US-built F-16s flown by several NATO nations in particular focus. However, Western governments have been wary of leaving their own countries undefended by giving away too much equipment. They have also avoided sending anything that could strike deep into Russian territory and give Moscow a reason to escalate the war.
Also, if I may, do you think Norway...
When it comes to F-16, I really don't want... it's not on the agenda now, and I really don't want to speculate in any possible future donations.
On the Storm Shadow, all I can say is it is my understanding that it has been used since we announced its deployment to Ukraine, but I'm not going to go any further details of that operationally.
The sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines last year is a clear reminder of what is at stake here. Our signing today is therefore very important. By working together, we can improve our abilities to detect submarines, counter mine threats, and to protect critical infrastructure on the seabed.
The sourcing and flow of weapons on both sides of the war in Ukraine was on the agenda at Thursday's session of the United Nations Security Council. Council representatives pointed fingers towards the parties they deem responsible for the continued aggression. As the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Adediji Ebo, updated the number of civilian casualties to at least 23,821 since Russia invaded February 2022. The Council session took place against the backdrop of a new package of sanctions announced by the United States and the rest of the group of 7 major economies.
Since 24 February 2022, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 23,821 civilian casualties in Ukraine. 8,836 killed and 14,985 injured, with the actual figures likely to be considerably higher. Most of the civilian deaths and injuries continue to be caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including attacks by heavy artillery, tanks, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes.
Using Ukraine as a testing ground to drag out the conflict to the last Ukrainian in an effort to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. This is based on the obvious desire to continue to dictate their will and their so-called rules to everyone. Billions of dollars are spent pumping weapons into Ukraine from the pockets of taxpayers, which flow into the accounts of the Western military-industrial complex.
Ukraine will continue to exercise its right of self-defense in strict accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We will continue to fight until every Ukrainian citizen and every parcel of our sovereign land are liberated and Russia suffers military defeat in Ukraine.
The provision of weapons for Ukraine's territorial defense is not extending or exacerbating this conflict. Rather, these arms help repel Russia's invasion of its neighbor and prevent an even further invasion of Ukraine's sovereign territory. These arms shipments help prevent Russia from further brutalizing Ukraine civilians, forcing them from their homes, and driving up energy and food costs across Europe and around the world.
Russia sources weapons for Putin's illegal war from states such as Iran and DPRK, in blatant violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. the UK calls on other states not to provide Russia with military assistance. The cost of this war is felt around the world. Its impact on food and commodity prices is severe. We welcome the continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and call on Russia not to hold up the movement of ships under the deal as a pressure tactic.
Poorly managed weapons, stockpiles, and supplies can be diverted to terrorist groups or other malign actors. It is critical to guard against such risks. We have seen how illicit weapons transfers to such groups were behind the proliferation of violence and numerous attacks against civilians and undermined the security and stability of many states. We underline, therefore, the importance of appropriate management of weapons during transfer, storage, and deployment.
Meanwhile, the United Nations says 3 new ships have been authorized to take part in a deal allowing the safe Black Sea export of Ukraine grain as global wheat prices fell further a day after Russia agreed to extend the pact for 60 more days. Russia had threatened to quit the Black Sea Grain Initiative if a list of demands to overcome obstacles to its own grain and fertilizer exports was not met by May the 18th. The Kremlin said it had extended the agreement because some results from talks had given it certain hopes, but more progress needed to be made. UN Deputy Spokesperson Farhan Haq said the Black Sea Grain Initiative's Joint Coordination Center authorized 3 new vessels to travel to the Ukrainian ports of Odessa and Chernomorsk. Russia continued its wave of attacks on the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, and other cities this week. The missile attacks came amid a looming deadline for the Ukraine grain deal. But we're now being joined by Deutsche Welle correspondent Chibonda Chimbelu to tell us more. Chips, good to see you. What's the latest now?
Well, the latest, of course, is the fact that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will be heading to the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan. Now, the G7 summit, of course, brings together the leaders of the world's richest democracies, and they will be discussing Ukraine and sanctions against Moscow, among other things. But, of course, those 2 topics are on top of that agenda at the summit. And the Ukrainian president would have an opportunity to make his case to them in terms of getting more support from them, but not just to the leaders of the G7, but also to leaders from countries including India and Brazil, which of course have been taking a more neutral stance when it comes to the war in Ukraine and condemning Russia on its aggression. So we will see what will be going on there. Of course, that all comes with the barrage of attacks that we've seen Russia in terms of sending more missiles targeting the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. And also this week we saw Russia waiting until the very last minute to agree to an extension of the Ukraine grain deal, which is extremely essential for global food markets.
Well, many wondered, Chip, what indeed many can expect from this extension and if it will really hold.
Well, the grain deal was, of course, set to expire on May 18, but it has been extended another 60 days and will expire on July 18. The 60-day extension means that the parties involved, that is Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and of course, the UN has also been involved, especially at the beginning. They will have to come together and sit down to talk about another extension potentially. And what we will potentially see will be Russia, trying to benefit from this grain deal and using it as leverage in trying to get more concessions from the international community in terms of sanctions. And so that's what we will see, because of course that grain is essential for global food markets, and so that's something that Russia will easily try to take advantage of to perhaps try to negotiate for less sanctions and get more concessions from the international community.
But then how much does, the deal help Ukraine's economy, which has been battered by the war?
Well, this deal helps provide some relief for Ukrainian farmers because, of course, they've been struggling in terms of safety, but of course also in terms of losing workers, skilled workers who have had to help with the war effort. We do have forecasts that say that Ukrainian wheat production will be down by as much as half compared to what it was before the war. But this deal, of course, provides some relief in terms of revenues. The farmers can continue to sell their grain to international markets, and in doing so also help, the people who work for them. But this deal doesn't really help the Ukrainian economy as much as it helps the global food markets, because the Ukrainian economy is battered by the war, and of course other exports cannot leave the country. So any non-food exports, that would be minerals and other items that are produced in the country, cannot leave the country via the Black Sea, which is blockaded by the Russian Navy. They will have to leave via land, which is of course far more costly. So the Ukrainian economy will not be benefiting as much as, say, countries that will be buying that Ukrainian grain that will land on international food markets.
We continue to keep our eyes on that. Thank you, Chip. Chiponda Chimbelu, Deutsche Welle correspondent, joining us from Berlin.